We wanted to just let you know that we'll be using the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen. And that's a place where you can ask questions or answer questions that we might ask, send us some emojis. And yeah, so we'll be doing that. We'll stop periodically throughout our program to take those Q&As and try to get to all of them. But I think that we are just about time at 10 o'clock, and this is a 45-minute program, just so you know. All right, so 10 o'clock. Welcome, everyone, to Angel Island State Park. We are so happy to have you here. We're celebrating Lunar New Year here in the detention barracks at the old historic U.S. immigration station here on Angel Island. And we first just want to tell you a little bit. Well, 新年快乐.
恭喜发财.
I'm Amy.
My name is Cynthia.
And yeah, first we just want to show you where Angel Island is, just because if you're not from the San Francisco Bay Area, you may not know exactly where we're zooming to you from. But the Angel Island is the largest island in the San Francisco Bay. There it is. And you can see San Francisco in the background, the Golden Gate Bridge there. And we are standing at the immigration station where that red pin is there. And then Angel Island, of course, was the home to the Coast Miwok, who were here for thousands of years, and this is their ancestral homeland. So we are going to be talking about Lunar New Year. So Cynthia, what is Lunar New Year?
Yeah, Lunar New Year is a holiday that celebrates the beginning of the new year based off of the lunar or the moon calendar. And so the traditional new year of celebrating on January 1st, that's based off of the solar calendar or the sun. And so Lunar New Year is just a little bit later on in the year because it's based off of the moon cycle. And the start of Lunar New Year officially was last week, I believe.
That's right.
And so we're kind of working in the first or second week of the Lunar New Year. And it is a very significant holiday for some Asian cultures. In particular, it's very prevalent in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese cultures. And Lunar New Year is to celebrate the end of winter and the welcoming of spring. And here at Angel Island, a bunch of big rains just stopped today. And so maybe that's some good fortune that we're looking at right now. And some general traditions that we see for Lunar New Year involve a lot of special foods, traditional dresses and decorations. And I can show you some of those in these photos right here. These red lanterns are very common to see displayed for Lunar New Year. We have special foods like dumplings. We'll explain why those became traditional foods for Lunar New Year. And other little things that might be eaten or even offered to ancestors as well. But the reason that we want to talk about Lunar New Year today in front of the detention barracks is because a lot of the history here involves Asian immigrants. And so even though normally we talk about the general immigrant experience here, we want to focus on what celebrating this holiday may have been like for them. But before we get to that, we have a question for you all.
Yeah, so how many of you have celebrated or do celebrate Lunar New Year? Maybe that involves going to a parade, eating out dinner, doing a celebration with your family. You can put those into the Q&A down at the bottom of the screen there. It says Q&A, and you can answer there and share. Teachers, if you're joining, you can maybe poll your class, get a raise of hands and tell us what percentage of kids have celebrated or celebrate Lunar New Year. And yeah, just pop that down in.
And if you haven't celebrated Lunar New Year before, drop that answer down too. We'd love to know who's kind of new to all of these traditions.
Absolutely.
But Amy, have you celebrated Lunar New Year before? While we were waiting for those answers to come in, we'll kind of answer our own for this.
Yeah, I have celebrated Lunar New Year. And I still do, actually. I lived in China for 2 years when I was just out of college. And actually, when I was in China, I didn't really celebrate Lunar New Year because Everyone celebrated it with their families, and they left the university where I was working to go back to their hometowns and be with their families. And so I used that time period, which was a big holiday in China, to go travel around the country. But here in the United States, I celebrate with my friends and family.
All
How
right.
about you?
Yeah,
Do you
I
celebrate Lunar
definitely.
New Year?
I've celebrated Lunar New Year ever since I was little, as long as I can remember. And the tradition with my family has not really changed all this time. We get together, my parents and my sisters, and we eat hogel or hot pot, which is a very traditional, just general celebratory Chinese food. We've got a couple of answers coming
Yeah.
in.
I
Uh,
see we are getting ready to celebrate in Weaverville at Joss House State Park. Oh, super cool. Someone else says, no, we don't celebrate it. And another one says he has been to celebrations, for example, in Eureka, in their historic Chinatown. Thank you all for sharing. So, yeah, some people who don't celebrate or don't know much about it, and some people who do celebrate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for those answers. And throughout the presentation, again, we're going to have a couple of moments where we can answer questions. And so just drop them throughout the presentation. When we get into those Q&A sessions, we'll go ahead and pop them open and answer what people have. And if any folks are used to the ports on demand that we have, we're not going to be able to hear you. You're not going to be able to unmute yourselves. So that Q&A typed feature is the only way that we're going to be able to interact with you all.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, Cynthia, let's just talk about the immigration station here. Why is it here? And just give us sort of an overview of what it was and who was held here and why and its significance.
Yeah, absolutely. As you might be able to see, we're standing in what looks like a very old building, and this was opened in 1910 to 1940. So this was over 100 years ago. And the reason that this building was built here is because it was meant to hold immigrants who were waiting to see whether or not they were allowed entry into America. And let me actually show you a photo of what it looks like a bit further away so you get a better idea of what we're standing in front of right now. This is a historic building. So this means it is the original one that was out here over 100 years ago. And most of the immigrants held here were from Asia. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this kind of special combination Lunar New Year presentation for you all today. But before we really get into the details of what the immigrants here experienced, what makes someone an immigrant?
Yeah,
Let's
good
go ahead and
question.
define that. We want to make sure we're all on the same page. An immigrant is someone who moves from one country to another country with the intention of starting a new life there. And then, so for example, just for me personally, both my parents are immigrants from Taiwan, and my dad came over first, brought over my mom, and they moved here to America with the intention of starting a new life, having me and my sisters, and starting a family here. And Amy, I know you said that you studied in China for a couple years, but that doesn't make you an immigrant, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I went to China for 2 years, but I never intended to live there or move there permanently. I actually had some friends who also went and they did become immigrants, but for me, no, I always planned to come back. So I came back to my home country, the United States.
Yeah, so with those two examples, an immigrant, again, is someone who moves from one country to another with the intention of starting a new life there. And the stories that we're going to be sharing today are the stories of the immigrants who are held inside this building. But Amy, why were there so many Asian immigrants held here? Why was it like disproportionately in that direction and not kind of like evenly across immigrants coming through?
Yeah, so 2/3 of the immigrants who were held here were Asian, 1/3 were Chinese. And that is because of the country's first immigration law that was passed in 1882. And it was called the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And this law barred Chinese laborers, so people who worked with their hands, from entering the United States. They were no longer allowed to immigrate. And white Americans at that time and their elected officials, they blamed the Chinese for taking away their jobs. And this is actually kind of a common theme that has happened throughout American history, where the most recent immigrant gets blamed for taking away jobs or for problems of the United States. So I don't know about you, but when I hear that simply because of your one, your nationality or your race. You are not allowed to enter the country to become an immigrant. Does that sound fair to you, Cynthia?
No, definitely doesn't sound fair.
Yeah. Today, we acknowledge and recognize that that law was racist, that it was discriminatory. However, this immigration station during that time period, 1910 to 1940, was built to enforce that law. And so that is why so many of the immigrants here were Chinese. And also, it didn't just stop with that first law. There were subsequent immigration laws that were passed that included almost the whole continent of Asia. It was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. And this meant for almost all Asians, it was incredibly difficult to gain entry into the United States. So the immigrants who did come, they were held here in this building while they waited for immigration officials to determine whether or not they would be allowed to come into the country. So we are going to go inside of the building right now. And I want to just show you a little bit very quickly of the outside. So you can see the fence that surrounds this entire building. And on all of the windows in this building, they are covered in fencing or caging. We're going to go inside this room here, which was a Chinese men's dormitory room. So while people were here, they were segregated by their nationality and by their race. In this room alone, over 100 men were held here. You can see these bunks. There are a set of 6 bunks between 2 poles. They were not very big bunks. You wouldn't have known the people you were next to. These were really crowded conditions. And one of the pieces that was so hard was for the immigrants. They did not know how long they would be detained while they were here. So there was not just a lot of sitting around and boredom, but also a feeling of anxiety, worry, fear that they would not be allowed to enter the country. Now, I also want to point out what is something very significant about this building, and that is the walls. Because while the men were hanging out in these rooms, the Chinese carved poems into the walls. And these poems described how it felt to be held in this building. And it's a really amazing historic resource that we have because in the immigrants' own words, we know how they felt to be held here in this building. And you can see on the walls here, they're kind of challenging to see, but they are filled with poems. Here's a place where we've removed some of the paint layers that were applied over the years. And we've discovered so far over 200 poems in this building. And we're still continuing to find more.
All right, and let me go ahead and just turn this camera around so I can join you, Amy, against the walls. And there we go.
So Cynthia, we talked about these conditions. We talked about the immigration station and why it was here and why so many immigrants were Asian and particularly Chinese. What do we know? And we also know that people were held here for really long periods of time. For the average Asian immigrant, 2 to 3 weeks, but many people were here for months, some people even years. And so I wonder, do we know of any accounts of celebrating Lunar New Year? Because obviously Lunar New Year must have happened while people were here.
It must have. And this building was open from 1910 to 1940. So it was open for 30 years of history. And so we must have some story of an immigrant being held here during Lunar New Year. But we've looked into the stories, we've read all of the carvings on the walls, and we actually have not been able to find a direct account from an immigrant stating what it was like here during Lunar New Year. But the focus of today's presentation is going to be me and Amy sharing what we do know of what it was like here, sharing what we do know about Lunar New Year, both from our research and personal experience, and just speculating or imagining what it may have been like to celebrate a special holiday like that in conditions like we're seeing in here. And so the first kind of speculation or imagination that we want to focus on is that family separation was a very kind of integral part of what happened here at the detention barracks. And as I mentioned, being together with family is such an important part of Lunar New Year. So, how would being separated from family in conditions like this impact celebrating a holiday that's focused on family? And so, for that, we have a couple of stories of Angel Island immigrants that we want to share that not during Lunar New Year, but did go through that factor of family separation that happens so often at the barracks.
Yeah, so the first story that we want to share is about a young boy named Robert Von Yee. And one thing to know is that I mentioned earlier, people were segregated here by their race. They were also separated by age. So Robert Von Yee, he came with his mother and his older brother. He was 12 years old. He was coming from southern China, and they were trying to join their father here in the United States. And he and his older brother, they were separated from their mother. She was held in another building on the site, and they were held here with the men. They didn't know any of these men. They were young children, and they were here with strangers. And that's what his recollection, when he is told his story, he says, we were here with a lot of strangers, strange men. He and his brother were held here for 1 month while they waited to see if they could gain entry into the country. So we just want to also give you another story of another version of family separation that would have happened here.
This story that I have is of once again another young Chinese boy who was held here. His name was Ben Choi, but he was not separated from his mom from the physically here at the detention barracks. He was separated from her just from the virtue of his immigration story. So what I mean by that is that in 1930, Ben Choi was 14 years old, and his father told him, go join your uncle in America to help make wealth and bring back money to the family in China. And Ben Choi did not have a say in this. It didn't really matter if he wanted to or not. And he said, quote, I couldn't refuse. When they say you go, then I go. And he also mentioned that separating from his mom in this moment was very difficult. He said, quote, the parting with my mother was heartbreaking. I cried all night and the pillow was completely drenched with tears. And so when we think of these two stories of Robert Von Yee separated from his mom who was being held in a different building, or Ben Choi who had to leave his mom behind as he started a new life here in America, if we imagine what these conditions may have been like during Lunar New Year, it must have been really difficult because this holiday was so important for family.
Yeah. And, we often talk about immigration and the push-pull factors of immigration. Like, why does someone leave their family, their language, their culture, their mother to come to a whole new place and go through such a hard experience? And often this is poverty, war, famine, all sorts of things that might push you out of a country. And pulling you to a country is opportunity, the chance for a new life. And so those are true for 100 years ago for these immigrants we're talking about today, but they're still true for immigrants today too.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about these conditions, kind of imagining what the immigrants may have been going through while they were being held here, the next part of our presentation is going to focus on Lunar New Year traditions and how even being separated from family, even being held in a place, a room that looks like this with the crowded bunks you saw earlier, how might, despite all of this, they try to celebrate Lunar New Year while they're here. But before we do that, we've talked a lot now, and we want to make sure to get to your questions if there were any. So teachers, go ahead and poll from students if there's any, and go ahead and drop any questions you have into the Q&A. We'll just wait a bit and see if any come through.
Okay, cool.
And for you, Amy, when you were researching about the Lunar New Year experience here at the Angel Island detention barracks, what were some of the sources that you went through to try to find that information?
Yeah, well, these days almost everybody's using the internet, so definitely there. And there are some amazing resources like the foundation that we work with. They're called the Angel Island Station Foundation, and they have many stories of in the YouTube channel of personal immigrant stories, which is really wonderful to check out. But also books. We have a lot of great books that have been written about the walls and the immigrant experience here.
Some fantastic historians, Judy Young, Erica Lee, and Mark Lai,
Yeah.
and their resources have really been invaluable.
And there are films as well by Felicia Lowe, for example. So shout out to all of those people who did so much work to tell this story. I see we do have a question here, which was, what was the longest time someone stayed here? You want to go for it?
Absolutely. The longest time that someone stayed here, what's interesting is there are actually a lot of records that burned down upon the closing of this station. And so even though we have oral stories or people telling stories of how long they were held here, the longest story that we have on record, so basically on paper, is 25 months, so just over 2 years, of a 16-year-old boy named Kong Di Kwang. And he was looking to unite with his father while he was here, but because of some legal things and his father going to court to try to get his exclusion reversed, he was held here for over 2 years while his father was trying to get him to join him.
Yeah, really long detentions. We have one more question, which is, in what year did Lunar New Year celebration, I think that was meant to be begin?
Ooh, what year?
Yeah, gosh, time immemorial, I would say. I mean, Chinese culture is really ancient and long. And so I imagine, I don't know the answer to this, but I think it's a very long established practice. Um,
Yeah,
do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have an exact year, but I do know that if you go into the folklore and like the fairy tales of Chinese culture, like
Yeah.
they're even persistent there.
Yeah.
And so it's just like really any kind of text that you read, as old as you can go, you can find celebrations of Lunar New Year. And because we do know that it was to, say goodbye to winter and welcome in the spring, I think as long as harvest was important, Lunar New Year must have been present during that. But that's a great question. I'm definitely going to look for
totally. that. One more question, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But let's talk about food, since food was such an important part of a Lunar New Year celebration. What was food like here at the immigration station, Cynthia? Can you talk about that?
I'll go ahead and answer that one.
Because people were provided meals. What were they like here?
They were provided 3 meals a day, and it was for free. But they were infamously bad. There was a lot of protests, a lot of riots and complaints about the food. In particular, for the Asian meals, and the reason why I specify that is because there was an Asian dining room and a non-Asian dining room. And so they were separated not only in the rooms that they were sleeping in, but they were separated in where they were eating as well. And the kitchen staff was given less money to pay for the ingredients for the Asian meals than the non-Asian meals. And so there's a big difference in quality as well. And here I have a photo of what the Asian dining room looked like for you all to imagine what eating here may have been. And these foods that were typically served for the Asian meals was overcooked rice, boiled pork, like salted preserved fish that you can find in cans, and what was described as boiled wilted greens. And so a lot of the people did not like the food here, but what they could do is, if they had family on the mainland, their family or their communities and nonprofits were allowed to send them food. And so if they're like, oh, I'm tired of this overcooked rice and this boiled pork and these wilted greens, oh, I have family on the mainland, I'm gonna eat the food that they sent me. And Amy, you told me a pretty fun story about this that we actually just learned.
Exactly. So we have a oral history, someone who was remembering his time here, a man named Yo Kang Dong. And in 1931, he was only 8 years old. He was here at Angel Island by himself, held here for 6 months, waiting to join his father and his grandfather. And fortunately for him, his parents, his father, would send him a crate of food every week. And many other, well, I wouldn't say many, but other immigrants too were receiving these wooden crates of food. And after a while, these crates started to pile up. And the Chinese men, they actually built a dragon out of these crates, and they draped fabrics on top of it. And this dragon, it was used, he said, in ceremonial moments. He doesn't say Lunar New Year, but gosh, we really imagine that it was for Lunar New Year. And as you might know, if you've ever gone to a Lunar New Year celebration, the dragon is often featured. And this is in San Francisco, one of the longest dragons you can find. And the dragon is a symbol of luck and good fortune. So I just love that story.
Yeah, imagining that even in conditions like this, where they can persist and add some kind of festivity and ceremony through these wooden crates that their family is sending. And so even though there might be some family separation that happens here, it's kind of a very touching, I think, in how families were still able to connect in this way by sending food.
Yeah.
And the next part that we want to talk about is the traditional Lunar New Year foods that might have been included in these crates. Because there are traditional Lunar New Year foods that people often eat during this holiday. And the reason why these foods have become traditional is because in the Chinese language, the word sounds like another word that they might want coming in the new year. And we'll explain what that means in a moment. But the examples that we're going to share today, me and Amy are going to use the Chinese dialect that we're familiar with, which is Mandarin. What I want to say though is most of the Chinese immigrants who passed through here, they actually would have spoken a dialect called Taisanese, which is much closer to Cantonese than it is to Mandarin. And so what we're going to be speaking today might not sound very similar to the dialect that most of the Chinese immigrants here would have used, but this idea of traditional foods and practices based on wordplay is definitely prevalent in all Chinese dialect speaking cultures. And so even though we're going to be speaking a different language, this practice is still, would have still been relevant.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the first food we got?
Okay, so the first food we have is...
We have it behind our camera. We're just going to bring it on over.
This is jiaozi, and it is a dumpling. And it's personally one of my very favorite foods from China. And inside is meat. And this wrapper, or skin that they sometimes call it, is pinched together with your fingers. And the word jiaozi, jiao, there's a homonym, another word that means coming together. So it's a play on words. The jiaozi is coming together, and it's also about family coming together. So this is a really symbolic food, the jiaozi. And maybe later we're gonna put these in the microwave and eat them.
I'm smelling them and getting hungry already. But Amy, could you actually bring those dumplings back for a second? Because I want to share one more thing about why these became a traditional food. Can you show a little bit closer what the shape of them was? So if you look at the shape of it, not only does jiaozi sound like together, they also physically look like a traditional Chinese gold ingot. And so eating dumplings not only meant bring togetherness for the new year, but also meant bring in money for the new year as well. And so I love this double meaning that it has. And I'm going to grab our next. Oh, Amy, you got it for me?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So the next traditional Lunar New Year food that we have is one that I'm sure all of you guys recognize, which is the apple. And the reason why apples have become a traditional Lunar New Year food is because in Mandarin, they sound like pingguo. And also in Mandarin, ping'an is peace. And so pingguo sounds like ping'an, which is peace. And so much like how eating dumplings is meant to bring in togetherness and money for the new year, eating apples is symbolic of bringing in ping'an or peace for the new year, because pingguo sounds like ping'an.
Awesome. And the last food we're going to talk about is juzi, or oranges, mandarin oranges, tangerines. The word juzi sounds like the word jiza, which means luck. And so you want to also bring in good luck into the new year. And you might see offerings, like if you're ever in a Chinatown, you might see a little platter of food in front of some photos or in front of a little altar somewhere. And this is an offering to people, ancestors, relatives who have passed, who are no longer with us. And this is part of the Chinese tradition and Asian tradition, really, of making an offering to your ancestors or your relatives.
And I actually have a personal example here of, it's not fancy, but it's the tiny kind of shrine or offerings at my personal family home, where we have actually laid out juzi for my grandparents who have passed. And those oranges that you saw Amy carrying, my parents heard that I was giving this presentation, and they actually gave me the oranges that you see in those photos. But we replenished those offerings, so my grandparents will be okay.
Good. I don't want them being shorted. Yeah. So we wanted to show you a carving on the wall. So it's true that there were many poems here on the walls, but there were also drawings on the walls. So here, this is a basket. Here's the base of the basket and sort of the handle of the basket. And inside of the basket are written different family names. And so this was an altar, a drawing of an altar, and people could honor their ancestors, their father, grandfather, here at this ancestral basket. And so today, in honor, on behalf of all of those immigrants who were held here, who maybe couldn't make this offering of special food while they were detained here, we wanted to take our food and make an offering to their ancestors. So I'm just gonna move this chair here and bring over our jiaozi and our fruits.
All right, thank you for doing that, Amy. And I'm actually going to pass the camera over to you because we have that really cool carving of the memorial basket here. I'm really glad that we're able to put down an offering of our own, but we actually have a poem inside the building that is talking about an immigrant's experience of what it felt like not to have an offering to give on a holiday while he was being held here. That poem, I'll go ahead and read a few lines of it for you, but it's in another room. So Amy, go ahead and follow me and we'll take them to that poem.
We're going outside. So the room that we were in, that was a Chinese men's dormitory room, and we're going downstairs to the first floor, which was also a Chinese men's dormitory room. And in this room, 200 men were held in this space.
See, there's less beds in this room, but all the holes that you see in here, when this was open for immigration, there would have been 6 beds between every set of these holes. But we couldn't keep them all around here, or else there wouldn't be enough room for our visitors to walk around. And the poem that I want to share with everyone, it starts right here and goes over here. And I'm just going to share a few lines of it, but this is a poem from an immigrant that felt sad and embarrassed about not having an offering on Mid-Autumn Festival. So not Lunar New Year, but this idea of having offerings to honor the holiday would have been the same between Mid-Autumn Festival and Lunar New Year. So first I'll read a couple of lines in Mandarin, and then I'll read a few lines in English as well. 夜凉张卧铁床中，梦来绮丽寒窗下，非已无备一收总。 The night is cool as I lie stiff on the steel bunk. Or I get up and stand beneath the cold window. But I have not prepared even the most trifling gift, and I feel embarrassed. And so, as much as I love that story that you told, Amy, about that 8-year-old boy, right, who was able to receive crates of food every single week from his family, this immigrant obviously did not have access to that. And so we also want to think about the immigrants who did not have that community or family support on the mainland to be able to alleviate being, or make their time a little bit easier while they were being held here, and not having those access to those special foods and traditions while being detained in a building like this. And we do have over 200 poems in here, but I do want to share with you all a drawing as well that is related to Lunar New Year.
And hey, Cynthia, while we're walking over there, I just want to give you big props for reading that poem in Chinese.
I appreciate that. My Chinese and my Mandarin is actually not that good, but I'm very lucky that I had my dad to talk to. I was able to practice the poem. I actually asked him to record himself reading the poem so I could try to get the intonation and the rhythm correct of it.
That's awesome.
So I'm very grateful that I have that connection. The lights have turned off here, but if I shine my flashlight, you'll see that drawing. Is it coming up on the screen, Amy?
There we go. So
Yeah.
you can kind of see it. It's a fish. And you can see the scales of the fish. The tail is on the right side. And the eye is actually conveniently where that chipped piece of paint is.
Yeah, I love how detailed this one is. But you all might be wondering, why are we showing a fish for this Lunar New Year presentation? Well, the answer is much like the traditional foods that we shared earlier with the wordplay, eating fish is also a very traditional thing to do during Lunar New Year. I'm just untangling this decoration that I have right now. And the reason why fish is often eaten during Lunar New Year is because there's a Lunar New Year saying called Nian Nian Yo Year, or may all of your years have a lot of abundance. But which means abundance, also sounds like for fish. And so Nian Nian Yo Year also sounds like may all of your years have a lot of fish. And so people often eat fish during Lunar New Year to, again, welcome in that abundance. But you'll also see in decorations, it's very common in Lunar New Year decorations to see fish in there as well. And Eve, if you want to go ahead and join me, we'll set up this tripod so we can talk a little bit more.
So we have been talking a lot about the Chinese experience here and sort of the East Asian experience, but there were people from over 80 different countries who were held here in this immigration station. And another really large group were Russians, many of whom were Jews. And so we also were thinking, what other celebrations might have been celebrated and how would it have been like? And so we were thinking for the Russian Jews, Passover, the celebration also of spring and escaping slavery to freedom, and all of the traditional foods that are really important for the Seder plate during that time of year. And we also know that the Hebrew or Jewish organizations in San Francisco were able to send food here and assist with them as well. And then another really large group of immigrants who were held here, they were Indians, people from India. And they too, were they celebrating Diwali here, the Festival of Lights? Were they able somehow to get the sweets, the mithai, that was so important and part of it? And firecrackers, that's another really big piece of Diwali. We're pretty skeptical that they were able to get those
Probably
here.
not. Probably not.
So yeah, just trying to think about what it's like for people to celebrate their traditions, their cultures, while they are in detention, while they are in a whole new country that they are immigrating to.
And so when we think about the stories that we've told today, Robert Fournier, Ben Choi. What was the story of the young boy that you told?
Yo Kang Dang.
Yeah, and so when we think about their stories, even though we're sharing today of imagining what it may have been like for Chinese immigrants about 100 years ago on Angel Island to celebrate Lunar New Year, this idea of struggling to connect with your culture, of trying to connect with your family, is not just that. It's an international story that the South Asian immigrants, that the Jewish immigrants, the immigrants from over 80 countries that passed through here would have gone through. And it is also a current phenomenon as well. Not only for immigrants who are currently going through the detention centers that are still around, but first generation, second generation, third generation descendants of immigrants having that struggle of connecting with culture, of connecting with family. I know for me personally, that's definitely something I relate to, where I was born in America, I've grown up in this country my whole life, and I definitely relate and embrace to the cultures here. But it's also very important for me to get better at Mandarin and connect with those cultures from Taiwan that may have not been passed down to me, from that have been very important to my family while being raised here.
Yeah, I love that you're still like reaching out to your dad and trying to learn and get all of this. It's really important.
And it's a very present experience for a lot of people that have really any immigrant connection here and there.
Well, we're going to go to our very last Q&A. So if you have any more questions for us, go ahead and throw them into the Q&A. So, here's one. Is it true that a Disney artist was held there? Yes, it is. Tyrus Wong, he was held here as a young boy, joining his father. And he went on to become a Disney artist who drew for the movie Bambi. He was an incredible artist, as well as just real thinker and philosophical about his experience here in the United States and immigrating. And he became really well known in Disney and with Walt Disney himself.
And actually, one of my favorite parts of the story is that if you look at the background of Bambi, you can see that there's a very clear traditional Chinese art style influence to it. And so his work inspired basically the look of Bambi, this very significant film. But he was not credited nearly the amount that he contributed to the film, because he was part of a workers' strike that was trying to advocate for better pay for the folks working on that movie. But because he was trying to stand up for himself and the people working in that industry, he ended up getting less credit for the film that he should have been given.
I did not know that part of it.
And then so he was an advocate in standing up for the people around him as well.
Yeah.
Oh, and actually, our person behind the computer but in the office was able to find the answer to that question that we got earlier, which was, what year did Lunar New Year begin?
Yeah, and he was Googling around and then found that it could be traced back to about 3,500 years ago. And that it has evolved, just as Cynthia and I were saying, over a long period of time, and its customs probably changed over the years. But yeah, that is from Timothy Lamb Museum of Anthropology.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
We got another question here. Is the immigration station open to visitors? Absolutely. Right now, we're giving this presentation before the museum opens, but if you go ahead and just Google Angel Island Immigration Station hours, you can find when we're open. Right now, we are closed on Mondays and Tuesdays, but if you come on other days of the week, just make sure to check your ferry times and that you have enough time to hike here, hike back, and still catch your ferry off the island, because there are no roads leading to Angel Island.
That's right. It's about a mile hike to get here. Well, we are going to wrap up our celebration here, and thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to do it with one more poem, and this poem was written by Ben Choi.
Oh, and give me a moment. I'm going to join you back.
Okay.
In a second.
We are going to end with a poem by Ben Choi. He is the young boy who Cynthia mentioned, who traveled here to meet, to leave his mother and start a new life here and support his family. He didn't write it as a boy, he wrote it as an adult, but it's just a wonderful capturing of, oh, hello.
Hi.
You changed.
Yes.
What's this all about?
Because we're saying a goodbye to everyone who has given their time today of spending a little bit of their Lunar New Year with us, I wanted to make sure I got into some red, which is the traditional lucky color for Lunar New Year. And this is actually from my grandma. And then so it's a very important piece of clothing for me as well. But I don't want to interrupt this poem from Ben Choi that we're going to read. So I am going to actually pull up some slides of the words so that you all can read along with us as well as we're doing this. And so, Amy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Tall drums are beating, cymbals are clashing, firecrackers are popping, and children are dashing to see the dragon wriggling its way through this merry Chinatown today.
Chopsticks are clicking, people are dancing, golden trumpets are blaring, and lions are prancing, gaily up and down each alleyway in this merry Chinatown today. And with that note, we want to welcome you all to maybe find a Lunar New Year celebration that's happening with you. If you have sound sensitivity, don't worry about firecrackers and loud noises, maybe avoid the parades, but you can get dumplings at a lot of local shops and, eat those traditional foods that we were talking about. So thank you so much for spending some of your time with us today. 恭喜发财，
新年快乐，再见。